Does it work? Yeah, it does work. Caught by surprise. All welcome to our debate this afternoon, the Aurora debate on science in a post-truth society, whatever that may mean. That is probably what we're going to discuss. It has become, or it is actually becoming, a good practice of us to have council meetings of presidents and then to put the presidents on the spot. Well, there they are. With some external guests that we invited from our universities to discuss with us this theme that probably concerns us very much. What is science? What is the contribution of science, and how should it be appreciated in society when society takes different views on how relevant truth actually is and discusses alternative facts? We'll discuss it. We'll have hopefully a very interactive debate that Gudmundur Hálfdánarson from the University of Iceland will lead us through. But the question itself is interesting. And the question, or the fact that we are so upset in academia about others challenging us is very interesting and revealing, I would say. We are not the first to be challenged by the rest of society on their authority. Others have witnessed this. Actually, everybody who is in a position of some authority is now and nowadays challenged by the world at large, the media, the internet, and any conversation that goes along there. For how come you can say this, and I believe something else, and why should I trust you? This is not just for us. It happens across society. What is also revealing, perhaps, is that some of us, and some much more than others, become very angry at this. And one of the things I've learned at home is when you get angry, when you get criticized, somebody apparently made a point that was relevant. And the question is, what is the point that society makes to us that actually is relevant? Maybe we haven't sorted out our stuff altogether that well. Perhaps we do overclaim. I have to step back. Oh, the lights, sorry. Get in the light, sorry for that. Perhaps we overstated too much the value and the relevance of science and our views of the world. Maybe we were not careful enough. Maybe we have not actually always said that science is always in progress. In 10, 20, 30 years' times, and sometimes even faster, new truths, new academic values will come up that make our perception of today's world different again. Are we really that good? Maybe we should tone down a little bit to become more relevant. Anyway, a lot to talk about. We have 2 hours, but we have many panelists. Gudmundur, the floor is yours.
Maybe we should start by people saying who they are, because I'm not so sure that we all know, and that will also mean that I have the pictures of everyone here, but they're too small, so I'm not so sure I can recognize everyone. So just quick.
I'm Ulrich Radke, the rector of the University of Duisburg-Essen in Germany.
Stefan Edin, Deputy Vice Chancellor of the University of Gothenburg.
I'm Fiona Lettis, Pro-Vice Chancellor for Research and Innovation at UEA.
I'm Herman van Goetem, Rector of the University of Antwerp.
Dan Fredman, the Rector of the University of Gothenburg.
Dagrun Olsen, Rector at the University of Bergen.
I'm Lise Dumazy, I'm Rector of the University of Grenoble.
Jonas Benediktsson, Rector of the University of Iceland, and it's a great pleasure for us to host this meeting.
René van Woudenberg, I'm a professor of philosophy at the Free University of Amsterdam.
I'm Margaret Ross, I'm Pro-Vice Chancellor for the People Strategy at the University of Aberdeen.
David Richardson, Vice Chancellor and President, University of East Anglia in the UK.
Ute Klammer, Director of the Institute for Work, Skills and Training at the University of Duisburg-Essen, Germany, and from 2008 to 2015, Vice Rector for Diversity Management and International Affairs.
And my name is Greg Kelly, and I am the new director of the FBI. I am the executive producer of a radio program called Ideas, which airs every weekday on the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation. That's the CBC, which is our equivalent of the BBC or Radio France.
Okay, so we are being monitored. That's good. The rubric of this discussion is going to be on universities in a post-truth world. And I've been asked, why do we speak of post-truth? Why don't we just talk about lie? So is there a difference between post-truth and a lie? And what does it mean? What is post-truth? What are we really discussing here? So I would like to have a response for that.
Well, I think we must define precisely post-truth, because, of course, in a discussion, what is truth? Of course, scientific questioning, we always have hesitations, we are not always sure, but that is not a question. If you are really distributing information which is false and you know it, I think that is the essence of the so-called post-truth events, what we saw. We saw it, of course, through political campaigns, but we see it also, for instance, now in Macedonia, these guys who are producing fake news and so on. I think we must define it as in the context of fake news. More, I think it has to be precise in this way.
But isn't that just a lie? Saying something that is false and on purpose? So are we discussing lies here, or are we discussing something else?
I think we could be discussing lies. I think we are in a world where people tell untruths, knowing that the person receiving them is willing to believe them because it's what they want to hear. I mean, I was heavily involved in the debate around whether the UK should leave the European Union. I took a view that we shouldn't, and I was allowed to represent that view on behalf of my university. And I suppose as an academic and a leader of a university, I've always been very careful to say what I think is the truth and to give real facts. I find myself on the political platform, shoulder to shoulder with politicians, and I knew they were not telling the truth. I'm sorry, but they knew they weren't telling the truth. But the people receiving that didn't mind, because they were receiving in their heart what they wanted to receive, rather than using their head to process the information and question it. So I think there's the issue of the deliverer and the receiver in this post-truth world.
Pam, you.
I think that going on and saying the post-truth, I think what we need to say is that knowledge is today's knowledge. We don't know about the knowledge for tomorrow. And we have to respect that could change. That is just, in my point of view, completely different from telling a lie. And I think that we have to work to gain the respect again for the knowledge we are creating and the knowledge which is so important for the society.
My own sense is that post-truth is a nickname for our age, our historical moment right now, and it's the confluence of a few things. It goes beyond simply lying. Politicians have always lied, corporations have always lied, and they'll continue to lie. But it's the knowing that you have a receptive audience. It is the confluence. Another factor is social media, which is, of course, neither. It's not real media, and it's not social. But it has allowed people to go into their own bubbles. Contempt for knowledge, contempt for received institutions and venues of authority, and hostility towards them as well. The social equivalent of holding one's hands to one's head, going blah, 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 I can't hear you, is more pronounced now up the socioeconomic ladder. You're allowed to get away with this among leaders, political leaders, in a way that you've never really seen before. When Donald Trump accuses CNN of being fake news, we know that we're in a new era, and yet, Donald Trump himself is glued to the television set every single day, being upset. Somebody else said, you're upset only when something hits you as being true. If it is absolutely fake news, what Donald Trump is watching, the man would not be upset, and he is perpetually upset, which is why I made the joke about the FBI. That's just the latest salvo coming out of his diuretic mouth.
universities and researchers, scholars have always tried to challenge the current paradigm, what we currently regard as knowledge, as truth. So the post-truth concept is something that should fit with what universities has always been about, to challenge. So that's I think it's important that we discuss what is truth, as already been touched upon here, because we are there to challenge it. What I think is at stake these days is the respect for critical reflection, and that's much, much more serious. And we can ask ourselves, as leaders of institutions, educational institutions, have we failed? Because this is one of the perhaps most paramount important tasks we've got, to educate the population, the public, in critical thinking. And we need to discuss how have we been performing in that way? How have we been able to provide that critical thinking to society? Or are we satisfied if we do or conduct our critical thinking at campus and doesn't include society at large?
Okay.
Well, I would like to add a more provocative note to this discussion about truth and post-truth society. Being trained originally as a philosopher, as you, I'm very hesitant about truth. So what's truth? Do we believe we know that what truth is? So what's wrong about alternative facts? The real interesting thing about the whole debate is that obviously citizens are taking their right to express their voice, and they have been forgotten. We have been too oblivious and not seen their real problems. So it's not the question of truth or alternative facts, but it's a new societal situation. And we as scientists, I think, we have to cope with it in research, in training, and in everything we can do.
Well, I agree with what has been said just now, but I just wanted to add that to me it seems it's not a problem really of truth or post-truth. It's a problem of relationship to information and to intellectual authority. I mean, we are in a world where many informations circulate, and people were not trained to look for truth between these informations. They're just all relative to them. They don't know why one would be would have more truth than another, and I think that they don't confide necessarily in a professor of university or in a researcher more than in their neighbor that says just the reverse of what says the professor or the intellectual. And so I agree that we have to think about that and to find the ways to explain not necessarily what is the truth, but how you can reflect upon things, upon information you have, how you can detect a lie or false information, how you can build your own access to knowledge. I think it's more this challenge.
So in a sense, I mean, there are many, of course, very complex issues here. First of all, truth is not a simple thing. I mean, it's not something that we can say. In many instances, we can say this is true and that is false, but in many questions in life, that is not so simple. And secondly, we are living in a more democratic world than we lived before. So information is floating more democratically than before, which means that it's less controlled. I mean, it's more difficult for institutions like universities to really to control the flow of knowledge, but at the same time, flow of disinformation. So.
Me. Thank you very much, Guðmundur. I think we are also talking about propaganda here. We have to be very clear about that, and opinions versus facts or truth. So people want to use these opinions as facts for their propaganda. And it's very difficult, as you are explaining now in this digital world, where one tweet. If you have 5 million, 15 million followers, it's people just look at this, they support this politician or this person, this opinion, and they say, this is what I stand for. And that makes it extremely difficult. And universities, they have to make sure that they support critical thinking, support science, and are totally against when science is undermined. That's the key thing.
Yes, I agree with that. I come at this from the background of a lawyer, and in fact you'll find material online where lawyers argue that alternative facts are fine because lots of people have a different interpretation of what they see. In the legal context, you don't get at the absolute truth. You get at a balance from the facts that people see. But I think we as universities are the guardians of the rigor. We need to encourage people to be rigorous with facts. But the Harvard website that is charting the first 100 days of Donald Trump comments that we have to bear in mind that everyone carries a rucksack on their back full of their own insecurities, their own agendas, their desires to look for allies and to be conscious of their opponents. And we would be doing a disservice if we don't bear that in mind as the context into which we have to put our science and our wisdom. So we have to be able to articulate it in a way that will make it more attractive than an ill-informed propaganda tweet that comes from wherever. So I think we risk taking the sort of moral intellectual high ground. We need to find a different ground from which to put our thinking into the agenda.
My short contribution will be this. I don't think that the notion of a post-truth society makes any deep sense. So it must be a term for something other than that, because our entire language, our entire mode of operation is saturated with the idea of truth. So when I say, I believe that Reykjavik is the capital of Iceland, I'm saying I believe it's true that Reykjavik is the capital of Iceland. So whenever any expression of the sort, I believe this, really means this is true, or I believe it is true. When we say this follows from that, we are saying it's true that this follows from that. We cannot escape the entire use of the notion of truth altogether. So it must be something completely different. It just makes no sense to say we live in a post-truth society. Many of the things that we live with on a very daily basis, it's all based on, it's all the product of serious investigation that scientists, technicians have been doing. They've been basing their whole operations on what they held and what actually was the truth. Otherwise, it wouldn't have worked. So I'm not at all skeptical, to say to my German colleague, about truth. So I do think that the proper goal of scientific investigation is truth and the avoidance of falsehood. But that is not the very same thing as saying that we are always very good at finding out what the truth is. And I think that in the public presentations of science, we should make a lot of qualifications there. Right, I'll stop here. Thanks.
Okay, I just want to, Staffan, I just want to make one comment, and that is from the scientific perspective. Every year there are confidence measurements in the Swedish society, and each year journalists get the lowest confidence, and university professors the highest confidence. But that is actually changing. So the confidence for universities is going down when you do these surveys. And I think we really have to look at what we're doing ourselves and our systems in terms of creating confidence for truth, so to speak. I mean, there are many things happening in the universities. We have frauds, we have people who are not behaving as we wish they should behave. So we have a responsibility for preserving the confidence in universities and truth, so to speak. That was just a comment.
So confidence and trust is something that we need to have.
I think it's really important, yes.
I think we have a question from the audience. Amy Rust, was that? No. You have to be democratic here, so.
Cool. John?
Yep.
Yeah, fab. I do that every time I get a mic. Amy Rust, University of East Anglia. My question was, is what we are experiencing really post-truth, or are we experiencing something else? And also, is it a new concept? Has post-truth always been around, or is it something new to this era?
I really looked it up as a historian on the really reliable site, Wikipedia. And they said that it was coined in 1992 by a Serbian-American playwright called, I have the name somewhere here, but I don't remember. So he was responding to Iron Contra and Watergate. So this is not new. I mean, this has been going on, but this has really exploded in the recent months and weeks. And I would like to get a little bit into that. Why is that? Why are we talking so much? Why is this on? Why are we discussing this here now? I mean, in 1992, we'd probably not have been discussing post-truth, but why is it so important now?
Well, I think it's important to realize that the role of knowledge and the demand for knowledge has changed, and it changes rapidly. It's not long ago since politicians, and this might seem as a paradox, they ask for knowledge and research-informed policy making. So that has emerged over quite a few years. So research, what we do, what kind of knowledge we create in universities has impact for policy making, decision making in society at large. So I think the interest in discussing the state of what kind of role knowledge research and universities, for that sake, should play in society. Well, we did debate that to a much larger extent these days, because knowledge is so imperative to societal development, so imperative to policy making and things like that. Then, of course, it's obvious that more people is eager and out there and willing to discuss with us what is sort of this knowledge all about, what is truth. And, well, in that sense, you can say perhaps it's a part of a democratic process. And of course, the access to knowledge, access to research through the net and the electronic area helps that a lot. So I don't necessarily find it unnatural at all. Perhaps it's an unavoidable consequence of a democratic process and the access to knowledge.
I was going to build a bit on Stefan's point. So there was a poll in 2016 in December about trust of different groups of people. So this is post-Brexit, post-Trump poll, and scientists were still trusted 80%, politicians 20%, and in the middle, economists 48%. And I think part of the distrust is that perhaps taking some truths and facts, we try to then make predictions, and we get those predictions wrong, and that starts to lower the trust. But I think the important message that I took from that poll was that scientists are trusted, and so we really need to work with that level of trust and try to be responsible and engage with the general public in language that they understand. So try not to be too jargonistic, try not to be too arrogant about our points of view, to try and use our positions to engage in debate, not shut down debate, and things like that. So I think actually it's good news that we're trusted as scientists in the community, but that comes with a lot of responsibility as well.
Sorry, I was just going to say that you mentioned earlier, what is it about post-truth moment right now? Is it different than before? And I think it is. You'd mentioned something earlier, too, that we're now living in a more democratic age, which we're not. Knowledge is more democratic, but power never before has been concentrated in fewer and fewer hands. Look at wealth distribution in the United States alone. Look at the 1%ing of property ownership. Look at the impossibility of anybody under a certain age or a certain income bracket ever owning a home. The American dream, as the comedian George Carlin once said, makes sense only to people who are asleep. And commensurate with this 1%ing is the corporatization of, if you like, truth. Donald Trump got elected on the premise, a very loose one, of being America's businessman, put a businessman in the White House. And as we know, corporations have been playing fast and loose with the truth since forever. Take a look at big tobacco, problematizing knowledge, problematizing the truth, that we need another study. Okay, there might be a correlation between smoking tobacco and cancer, but we don't have causation. This is the argument they made for decades. Big sugar did the same thing. Big oil is still doing it. When we do a program about climate change, even saying climate change, the lunatics come out in full force. They'll come out and they'll come after you. But they don't listen. They haven't listened to the program. And so universities themselves, the corporatization of the university, you know, when you take a look at centers that receive a lot of funding and receive the donations, it's usually from somebody with a lot of money. And the institution is then named after that person, usually an old white guy. Donald Trump believes authority rests with him. The post-truth moment, to me, one of the things that it signifies in the many valencies that can be attached to it is the identification of truth, authority, knowledge with some kind of source of power. And institutions of power now, the Canadian thinker John Rawson Saul, we've seen over the last 3 decades, but accelerated in the last decade, a slow-motion corporatist coup d'etat, Panama Papers and so on. These people play by different rules. And I think one of our colleagues from your university, Hubert, who is in the audience here, referred to 1930s Germany, and he mentioned, Hubert did, about German science, German physics, and things that were outside the boundaries of what could be called German physics, meaning physics, truth, discovered by Jews, was not allowed. Authority was not located in discourse of reason, it was located in discourse of power. And that, to me, is a shift. That is very much a shift. I will fire people with whom I disagree. Authority is not out there. It can't be arrived at by a set of principles. It's what I say. That's where we are right now.
So it's not only a question of truth, it's also a question of power. I think that is
very much so.
Yeah, just to continue with that, power is money and power is followers on Twitter. The communication, the medium we are using, that is power. So if you can build a following and you can build up trust, like politicians, they have their followers, they are trusted. And if they say something, it's like following a football team. We can discuss a game. If you support the team, you see the game differently than the other team and their supporters. And this is a very simplistic view of the world. And we can say university research and science, I mean, it's much more complicated, and people don't want to get deep into this. And it's easy to challenge because people don't want to get involved. They say, okay, I just trust this guy. And that's a challenge for the universities. We have to build up the trust. We have to make sure that the universities are strong. They are critical. The review process in science is critical. And I would like to say here that I would not say this is new. Here in Iceland, when I got involved first in university administration several years ago, there was this discussion here about dam building in the east. And there was this accusation against scientists here at the university that they let politics, their own personal politics, influence their science findings, scientific findings. So, I mean, this has been going on for a long time, but it's easier now to communicate because we have so many channels. It's not just the evening news. We only had one channel for a while and a few papers, but now you can form your own channel, and that makes it easier.
Yeah, so it's not necessarily more democratic, but at least the channels are less controllable by those who have the knowledge to control. So,
yeah. Yes, but I heard something interesting. The academization of post-truth. What is going on is, in fact, I think that what we see, and you said something about Jews, which was interesting because you could compare it with the method of negationism. People, to the negationists, building up an argumentation, you take some elements and you are just as a lawyer combining this in order to defend a position. And that is the way these kind of intellectuals are going on with, for instance, climate change or vaccination. This is more or less exact sciences, but we see it now also in Eastern Europe, and it was before Trump already busy in Eastern Europe in the last years. What we see in Poland, in Hungary, in Ukraine, and what is there going on, the way they are looking to their past. The past, because they are nations, they are building up their identity, and they are using, and there you see the same method. There are historians, so-called historians, journalists, and even at university, and politicians, and they are building up. They are using some arguments in order to say, well, we, during the war, and so on. In the discussion on the war, this is what you can see. The Holocaust in Poland, Hungary, Ukraine, it is already going on there for several years that politicians and universities and scientists together are using this kind of methods through a kind of patriotism, something like that. And I think, therefore, that our role as universities here in Western, in this part, is so important. And it is before 1940, it was in Germany, precisely in universities, that Nazism was rising so strongly and then infecting the world of intellectuals and so on. And I think that therefore our mission in this post-truth development is so important. I think these are the things where it's going on.
So where do you go? I take it. I think what you said is we have to take responsibility. I mean, it's a world with quick decision, and I think that politicians has a very difficult role nowadays because the media comes there. What is your opinion about that? There is no time for politicians to go back and really find what's behind it, what could be the consequences, and so on. What I think we have to do is we have to interact much more with politicians, with civil society, with different organizations, so that also within the university we learn how to communicate and how to be on the same trend, and also gaining back the trust for knowledge. And what you said about Western Europe, I would say as president for the International Association of Universities, the situation around the world on the democratic values is terrible. We see a lot of corruptions, and that is really scary for the future, and how we get the civil society to have the knowledge, the basic, to be critical individuals and see what's going on around.
So you said René, right? So at this junction, I think it's important to make a distinction between the ideal and the idea of a university, and I think the role of the academia in the current phase of history is really important. But we should always make a distinction between the idea and the ideal which we are striving towards, and the imperfect realization of the ideal. I do think that a little bit of the loss of authority of science has to do with, in the public sphere, an over-representation of certain results of science, an unnuanced way of speaking of what sort of results, certainly frontier science, what sort of results we may expect frontier science to have. There is a very interesting paper now some 10 years old by a Greek epidemiologist. I don't know, I trip over the word. And he says, well, we must assume that all the recent research findings are probably false. And there's this overhauling of... So there's a very interesting book. It's called The Half-Life of Fact. It's not a skeptical argument, but I do think it's a warning call. We must realize as academics that what's conceived to be true or what's held to be, as a matter of fact, to be the case. Well, for different disciplines, it takes more than 10 years for half of the facts to no longer be so considered. Well, but the idea of the university and the ideal of the university is there are truths out there laying for us to be discovered. What is true is not, what truth is not democratically decided. It's just there. And we need to find the proper procedures to get them fully in view. And we only can do that in an imperfect way. So this is a sort of nuanced view, nuanced way of thinking about science. We must try to get it across. And the final thing is, I was intrigued by what the work group of Jaap Winter brought out, societal impact. Well, I do think universities have an enormous societal impact through their students. They take up leading positions in society. And we should teach them properly about, well, have nuanced views about what science is, and also why a lot of these things about post-truth are ludicrous.
And I just, because my point relates to that, but also to the point made earlier about the power that big corporates have. And I mean, we as an Aurora network and people that we work in want to address major global challenges. And we back our researchers to do that. But as leaders, I think we also have to be ready and prepared to defend our researchers from aggressive acts from big corporates, because they don't necessarily want to know what you're telling them. And you mentioned climate change, and we had direct experience of that a few years ago in something called ClimateGate, where our university was essentially the subject of a cyber raid, quite topical these days, and tens of thousands of emails were stolen, selectively filtered to find one or two careless comments, and then used to claim that the whole of the research that supported climate change was false. Some of that work was funded by the US Department of Energy. We had Republican congressmen who were calling for my scientists to be put in prison, and we were hauled up in front of the UK's Parliamentary Inquiries Committee. And at these points, the university comes under great pressure to suspend scientists, to do inquiries into them, etc. And at the end of the day, the scientists have been faithfully working on what they think is a global problem that requires knowledge to address it. So there's a sense that even when you think that you're working on what should be important global issues, that should be popular issues to work on, that can change society, that can have societal impact, you've always got to be aware there are some people who don't want you to be saying what you're saying, and they do have a lot of power, and when they come at you hard, and it takes a huge, huge amount of the university resource to then defend yourself against it. And I think we have to be prepared for that if we want to address big global issues, because it will come again.
I often say that if we are not encountered, then we are not doing our job. If everyone agrees with what we are saying, then we are useless. So I think that is a part of our job.
That's a new topic you mentioned. I feel offended. I wrote an editorial some month ago. You have groups at the university who do not want to hear some people, right? And I'm a very peaceful person, but I get quite aggressive if it's going this way. So I try, even with support of forces, academic forces, of course, to support these. Right? If the person invited is not on the list for persecution or murder or something, I don't know. Right? If it's a legal person, right? And the students want to invite this side or that side, the person gets invited, right? Whatever the other side says. And that's what you mentioned, we have to fight for this. Right? That's really one thing. We can discuss this with this, how you call this? Trigger warnings? Yeah, somehow, right? Trigger warning is something very special, right? And
But I wanted to mention that, of course, we have to blame a bit ourselves. It's nice to be on the moral high ground, right? Of course, right? But some of our colleagues look at climate science. Like they did leave the ivory tower. It's good, but they with prognosis or scenarios, horror scenarios, try to get attraction in the public, visibility, more research money, and they left the field of scientific discussion. Like they went and made by themselves, tried to influence politics. Like we are advisors. Like we have to be very careful with this. Right? We do not make the political decisions. And of course, it's with power. Like history is written, you know it, written by the winner, of course. Like, and the moral high ground, looking truth and science. Max Planck wrote, what was it, 1948, a brilliant idea will make its way to the textbook, not because it's a brilliant idea, because its opponents die with time. Like so. You should be always aware, right, what truth is. And as a scientist, you know, you fail daily, right? And you try again and fail better, and try again and fail again better, right? But that's a process, and we have to discuss this. And as Ute Klammer told us, we have to discuss this with the society, right? So we don't produce truth, and of course it's nice to be on the cathedral and to tell the truth. You feel good on the moral high ground, of course, but we have to tell that we fail, but it's a process of gaining new knowledge, and that belongs to it, and we have to explain the process of how science is working. And if we do this, I think we can regain trust again.
I think we should move now to the second part of the discussion. I mean, we are floating there anyway, and in a good continuation on what Ulrich was saying, and to discuss a little bit about the role of universities in this malaise that we are living. Because I think we need to be self-critical, not only be critical of society, but we also have to be critical of our own position. So. What role has the university in this kind of creation of the situation that we are in?
Well, I think we have multiple roles to play and multiple responsibilities. First of all, we are all citizens in democratic societies, and we have to do our duty and not to fail like earlier elites did it, for example, in the Third Reich, as you mentioned rightly. So it's our own responsibility to ask ourselves, what can we do about these developments? And then, of course, we have a first mission and a second mission and a third mission. The first mission we discuss, research. So what do we have to do about research? The first thing is do research on the grand societal challenges, like in the Horizon 2020 program and other international ideas. We have to do research on all this, what's happening just now. Why? What are the new channels of communication? Why is populism rising and all this kind of stuff? We need more research on this. And then we need multi-perspectivity on this research, not just the truth, that's what I said, but we have different perspectives and we have to acknowledge this. And then we have the second mission, teaching. And about half of our young cohorts, every cohort is going through our hands. We are building the future society. So we have a big impact on education, and we have to teach our students a reflective attitude towards truth, towards society. And I think communicating with external actors is not a third mission, but it's the DNA of what we are going to do, what we have to do at universities. We have to implement this into our research, into our teaching. And this doesn't just mean transfer of our results into society, but it means community-based research. We have to develop our research together with external actors. We have to do service learning to teach our students how to involve in society. So we have a lot of obligations there.
Yes, can I just add an aspect which sounds really boring compared to all of these dimensions, but there's work going on at the University of Toronto at the moment to archive material that has been in the public domain, but where there may be a risk that that material will disappear from the public domain for whatever reason. And I think there is a role for universities to ensure that we try to archive in our repositories things that will help us understand society and the way things have developed with a historical viewpoint as well as with a currency viewpoint. And that's a very practical and potentially labour-intensive thing to do, but I think it's a very objective step that those of us in the Aurora network could consider doing for different aspects, especially of our core values.
A couple of weeks ago, a member of the British Parliament tweeted the following: "I do not regard academics or university professors as experts." And that sparked a lot of discussion and debate, at least in the internet. And to a certain extent, I think she was right. The reason is that as academics, as university professors, researchers, scholars, we tend to be more and more specialized. And in that narrow field, we are definitely experts. But what she probably were referring to is how these academics, how do they behave? How do we contribute when we're engaging in a let's say, broader discussion, debate? And in that sense, it's not necessarily like that we are experts. Because in a politician's eyes, it might not be that our discussions or contributions to the discussions are as comprehensive as they need. So I think the specialization we've developed in universities, research-wise, but also to a large extent educational-wise, that specialization can also be a threat to us as being experts in society. I think what we need to do is to rethink how we educate our students. I think it's important, imperative, that we, to much larger extent, provide cross-disciplinary research and education, so also our students in the years to come can become experts as parts of a society and can engage in discussions to a large extent that are meaningful also to society and people at large, because I don't think we necessarily are. It's about our specialization, it's about our lingo, it is how our self-perception as authorities on various fields. But then again, we fail to perhaps see that in other fields we do not have the same authority, yet we doesn't perhaps, or we tend to behave as we have. So I think we have to rethink, be a bit self-critical, and also realize that education and research should provide a solid background for, let's say, a more complex discussion also at the universities. Because if we're going to talk about the grand societal challenges where we need to contribute as researchers, as educators, they're highly complex. And then you need to reshape your education at least for that.
But isn't this in many ways the dilemma of universities, that in this kind of populist world we are living in, there's a very strong distrust of elites. But universities are elite institutions, and they do kind of nurture elitism. We do, in our rewarding of our scientists, we reward those who are doing the best research, which is often extremely specialized, and the researchers who speak to other researchers who are also specialized get most money. So it's in this one of the kind of problems of universities, or dilemmas of universities, that they are becoming more and more elite institutions at the same time as elites are distrusted.
It is a problem, but it doesn't have to be one. My own feeling is that the university has a lot to answer for the mess that we're in right now. It's not the only factor, but it's definitely one of them. I've heard a few things said about the sciences. I'm going to pick on my own discipline, which is literature. I took my doctorate at Oxford University in the late 80s, I think it was, yeah. And one of the reasons why I left and went into what I thought would be the security of journalism was I got sick of reading and writing in a certain way that I felt was being imposed upon me. My colleague mentioned the attitude and the authority and the lingo of the academy. Well, let me tell you that at that point, continental theory, literary theory, had embedded itself so strongly into the firmament of literary studies that you talked the talk or you walked. You did it or you got out. That's how dominant it was. And this is not a refutation of the truth claims of a Derrida or Foucault or whatever. And by the way, people at that point were using these thinkers and their allegiance to them much in the same way that high school students will use their favorite bands and so on. These were social markers among anything else. I'm not talking about the content of what they were saying. I'm talking about the automatic ascendancy that this kind of discourse had. And for the most part, these vocabularies were professionalized. They were arcane. They were obscure. You had to read not just the primary text, which was impenetrable. I saw Jacques Derrida speak at a full hall in Glasgow in 1987, I think it was. It was a Friday night. He filled up the hall, but within about 40 minutes, 2/3 of the audience had gone to the pub. That is not anti-intellectualism. This was a crowd of intellectuals. It was impossible to understand. It was impossible to understand. And with all due respect to Jacques Derrida, who also tried to get, I think, philosophy taught in middle schools and so on, I'm not going to pick on him so much. What I'm talking about was the professional need for the humanities to sound like science, because science was and still is the dominant discourse of our age, whether it's physics or cosmology or whether it's biology and origins of life, whatever. But it's still the dominant discourse. And so the vocabulary, the idiolect that you had to engage in, never mind a dialect, at least dialect has the idea of being a cross, of speaking a dialogue, some kind of travel is involved there, some kind of motion. It was an idiolect. And I don't know if this is the time to play that clip, the second clip. I'm not sure if we can do that. Guys at the back, yeah, are we good? Okay, so before we play it, little setup, it's hard to assume what's known and what's not known. This is a video clip from the satirical news site The Onion, which is more often than not absolutely superb in keeping its finger to the cultural pulse. And two, it makes reference to Judith Butler, who's a very preeminent feminist queer theorist, particularly in the American university scene.
Donald Trump. I voted for Trump because I thought he'd create a better America for everyone. But after reading 800 or so pages on queer feminist theory, I realize now just how much I've been duped. You gotta understand, I come from a small steel town in Pennsylvania. If I had known the foundational texts on intersectional theory, I would have never chanted, "Lock her up, lock her up." Lock her up, lock her up. We were told Hillary Clinton was the enemy. But it's clear now that the true enemy is a patriarchal, capitalistic society that maintains its ascendance by making powerful and ambitious women appear threatening, only to protect my status in a system purposefully designed to benefit cishet white men like myself. Jesus. When Donald Trump said he would make America great again, it's obvious to me now that he was only trying to play off my own complicity and comfort in an unequal social structure that disproportionately strips women and minorities, particularly trans and genderqueer people of color, of their autonomy and seeks to subjugate them to an invertebrate and intentionally antagonistic andocratic order. I get that now after I attended a gender-fluid, non-binary poetry slam at Swarthmore. A couple of other guys from work attended it too, and now it's all we talk about on the line. I like Trump because I thought he tells it like it is. But you know who really tells it like it is? Judith Butler. Gender is not to culture as sex is to nature. Gender is also the discursive, cultural means by which sexed nature, or a natural sex, is produced and established as predecursive prior to culture, a politically neutral surface on which culture acts. If I had just known that back in November, I would have never voted for Trump. God, how could I have been so stupid?
It is a bit unfair, but
It's unfair because nobody would believe that we could understand all chemistry or of physics and so on. But we are mocking about literature. I feel a bit uneasy about it.
Okay.
I feel perfectly at ease. And the reason is because I actually don't think, The Onion, I've read a fair bit of it, it is not that they're actually picking on Judith Butler's truth claims so much, because in fact, when you look at the aggregate of the stuff that The Onion makes fun of, it is the operations of power. They're actually, I think, pinpointing a few things that the Academy, particularly the humanities, and particularly literary studies, has to answer for. It's not that. It is the case that power works to exclude people, women, powerful women, and so on. There was a lot of misogyny directed at Hillary Clinton and so on. But the specialization of that vocabulary, the impenetrability, the comparison to chemistry, I think, is a false one. Stanley Fish, prominent American literary theorist, once said that physics has its vocabulary, I have mine, and he stood it. Well, I'm not so sure. I am not so sure that these ideas are so complicated that they justify a screw-you attitude to the reader. You need secondary, tertiary texts to understand this. A whole industry builds up around this. And John Carey, wonderful thinker out of Oxford University in the late 80s, wrote a book called, which should have been more widely circulated and celebrated, called The Intellectuals and the Masses. And what he did was he located the aesthetic of difficulty, particularly in poetry and to an extent novel writing, from about 1880 to 1930, among a certain intellectual class, and it is a class. And as mass literacy was spreading, so his thesis goes, this class felt more and more threatened and therefore built up the walls around itself more, so that instead of an educated layperson being able to understand a given poem, you would have very arcane references, unfootnoted snippets in other languages, whether it's from Ezra Pound and so on. And Carey did not want to throw these people out. He did not. He taught these people. He loved these poets. But he was, if we are wondering why people in the House of Commons are tweeting and the things that they have, and have this attitude towards the Academy, maybe it's time to question why the Academy has had this historic attitude towards people. It's not the only factor in this mess that we're in right now, a mess that has solutions, and I think the university is going to be central to that solution. Northrop Frye, he's not very à la mode right now, but literary theorist out of the University of Toronto, characterized the university not as the ivory tower, which sometimes it's guilty of wanting to be or becoming, but rather an engine room of ideas and so on. The university is one of the first places that gets clamped down on when there are tectonic shifts in society. And you would know that better than I, with the way that the universities got and students got killed in 1930s and 1940s. My own country, liberal, quote-unquote, Canada, under the previous regime of Stephen Harper, sent minders with scientists who were on the federal payroll to conferences to make sure that they did not color outside the ideological lines. Science was in service of the state, where it's critical to separate the university from the functions of the state and to keep that line patrolled. Sorry to use a military image.
Well, I'm not going to get into politics, choosing candidates or something like that. I think we should take a higher ground. They can all be bad, because this is propaganda. It is how they package their message. Some do it well. The public buys that message and votes for them, but the others can't do it well, but they lose. So I don't want to get into this. But the question was, how did universities in some way create this situation? And I found it very interesting. And since I'm
did they?
yeah, but since I'm an engineer, I think about technology. Obviously, technology has been created by the universities. In the core science has created the technology, which is creating the medium, which is causing this mess in a way. And we have to look at ourselves. But this is a good thing. So a good thing creates a mess, and that's a problem. But if we look at the value of the university, I think it's very clear. It has been stated here that we teach students, we educate the society. Many of our students go to become journalists and do a reasonable job, and we are teaching the public, and we need to do it well. That's really social responsibility. Also, the science is very important, as has been stated, but we also have to remember that we should be critical. It's extremely important at the universities that there is not just uniformity. Everybody agrees about everything. That will destroy the university. And this is important. I mean, we can look at, for example, now we have the historian here leading the discussion, but we had the economic collapse here in Iceland in 2008. And what was the criticism? That, for example, the experts didn't give any warning signs. I'm not criticizing them, but I mean, this is something that was being said. And the university experts, the accusation was that they were too tied to the banks and so forth. So it is extremely important that the university plays a role in being critical and not least be self-critical.
Yeah, in many ways, in the situation leading up to the class in Iceland crash in 2008 is kind of typical for the dilemma that many university people are in. I mean, money talks and research is expensive. And there is, therefore, the kind of people are attracted to money and they need money to do their research. And how can universities avoid that? We need money to function. We need money. Most of our universities are public universities. They need money from the state. Does that kind of compromise our situation in society?
Well, I'm coming to that, but I wanted to say two things. I think it comes out from the debate. We are scientists or professors. Universities are not there to tell the truth. They are not there to tell the truth, and we must not make people think that we are there to tell them the truth. Because, of course, the truth is the thing that we are just working on. We are there to learn, to teach them how to reflect by themselves, how to have a critical spirit in respect with all the information that are given to them. It's that which is most important. Now, of course, we do that with I hope so, with our students, but even when we are speaking, when people are trying to have talks with people outside, it's also the same mission, I would say. And the second thing, which I have not said, and I don't think I haven't heard it said, is that it must not be one sense, one direction. I mean, we must hear people, we must listen to people, we must listen to what they think, what they are waiting to. Of course, it's not to say that they are necessarily about one thing we are discussing on the same level, but if we are not listening to what they are waiting or what they think and so on, we will not be in any position to learn them anything. So it's very important that we have not this up position with the people we're talking, but that we listen to them too. Coming back to the question you've just posed, you just said about money. Well, of course, it is another problem and very important one, and that's why we must also think upon and we want to do that, upon the way universities are paid, have money to go on, public money, private money, and so on. But I don't think there is a, perhaps in some cases there is, but there is not always a direct link between the money you receive, from whom you receive the money, and what you say before that. There are many other ways as dangerous as that. And one has been said, ideology, for example, I'm sorry, perhaps it's a big word, but of course, if you see economy, it's evident that even if there's nothing to do with money someone receives, there are ideologies that determine the way scientists or social scientists see and analyze the world. And they may be true, they may not be true, but on different things. But that's also, I come back to my first point. That's the reason why we should not try to make think that we tell the truth, but just try to help people to find the truth themselves.
If I can elaborate a bit on the role of teaching, because I've over the last year or something like that, a couple of years, tried to find another word that describes the work of teachers in modern universities or in universities in years to come. And I've come up with the concept of curator of knowledge, because there is so much knowledge, there is so much truth out there. So to, as a teacher, act as a curator of knowledge for the students, for them to realize that there are, to a certain extent, conflicting data, conflicting or a multitude of truths, if you wish, information. So they need to navigate and deal with this. And then, of course, it's very important to help them to reflect. I think if you go back many years, and I think it's still like that at UK universities, one of the positions you've got as university teachers is the reader. What do you do then? Well, you read, obviously. And that was what it was all about, reading loud from textbooks. Okay, that was important in those days when students didn't really have textbooks. Now we have the opposite situation. There is access to vast amount of information, so how to navigate, how to reflect, how to deal with this. And that, I think, is important also, and a very important role for universities to take and teach students to do the reflection, but also work otherwise with the students as compared to teaching used to be. That's one thing. And I think, coming back to your question, the independence or autonomy of universities is extremely important. And the only thing which can sort of see to it that we maintain that autonomy when it comes to funding, that is a diversity of funding mechanisms. I think it's very important that there is a multitude of financial contributors to a university's activities. If you rely too heavily on one of them, of course that will sort of hamper or or that will see to it that at least your autonomy is hampered to a large extent. So a diversity with respect to funding mechanism, I think, is important. But in general, I think diversity is what a university is all about in order to maintain that dynamics, that independence, and that critical reflection that universities should and is all about.
I continue with the situation of autonomy. I think it's very, very important that we keep that, because that's the only way we can do free research to find new knowledge, that we can have the curricula for the students, which gives them the capacity to be critical individuals as employed or in civil society. And I would like to say that today we know that the number of individuals going into higher education is increasing all the time. So the situation you are referring to, where you had the ivory towers and it was very selected people, that's not the situation we have today. So I think that with more students, we also have a responsibility to see to that their knowledge within the society is what we are giving them. They should be critical. They should have the capacity. And we are threatened. And I don't like the diversity of funding. I think that it's a government who should fund the education and the free research. Because if we get funding from other parts, they will have a demand on us. And that is not good. It's not good for the students, it's not good for the science. So hopefully we can getting back the trust by interacting more with the society, so there are more people out there seeing knowledge within the society, knowledge from our students. That's important. And also maybe we can, in my opinion, get rid of this idea that you don't need the higher education institutions because you can have MOOCs and you can have courses online and so on. That is not what we are talking about when it comes to education and critical thinking. You can get information, truth or not truth, but we have a special role to give our students the critical thinking, to observe what's going on, and we have maybe to change the way we are doing education in many ways to really have something which is a complement to the information we get in society.
So you said there is some sort of a tension between public funding of universities and this critical role that universities have, and I actually agree with that. In a way, it's a very grand thing that democratic societies give public funding to universities, because they never know in advance what will come out of it. And we all know, or we should know, that academic life has two very different strands to it. It's valuing what's really important, and at the same time, it's relentless skepticism towards everything that's being said. And so what we are doing as academics is trying to come up with ideas, with theories, with statements that we are able to justify by any intellectual scientific means that we find valuable. But we never know in advance what's going to come out of it. So I do think it's in praise of our sorts of Western democratic societies that there is this public funding for universities. But I can also see that in other situations, private funding is the only way to get this academic enterprise underway, because I think in our part of the world, there's a very deep intuition that we have that there's a straightforward relation between truth and freedom. We believe that truth will set us free, and that's why in societies where truth is fettered by all sorts of ideologies, etc., and there is no space for free inquiry, well, their science is very bad off. And in those sorts of situations, well, we better have private institutions, private universities, where these sorts of fetters are there. So this is really in praise of democratic societies that give public funding to universities. It's a great thing. And it also means that we should be friendly towards those in power, and at the same time, we're with them in the same bed, so to speak. But we have different parts to play. I'm sorry for the metaphor.
Yeah, you confused me there, but anyway, sorry. I wanted to come back on what some of you have said about the role of the university as educating young people to become critical thinkers and use their critical understanding as a power in society and the roles that they take up. And I wonder if that is what we do ourselves when we are invited to tell the world what we think it is. What I see a lot, and I think around the world this is increasing, there's actually an extraordinary demand for scientific knowledge. Newspapers, any media want academics to tell them this is it. Maybe that's because religion fades in our part of the world. We need some other type of certainty. Tell us what it is. And it seems that many of us who in an academic way probably have been trained in this critical thinking and testing, and it's never really true, it's only partially true, or only now true, and then we'll find something else later on. In that pressure cooker of the media environment, you tell it in way too absolute terms. You suggest that something is really true, which actually isn't true, or it's only true under certain closely guarded parameters, and if you change them, something isn't true at all. And we are psychologically seduced to fill that gap because it makes us feel good that we are now the people who can tell the world, actually, this is how it is, and we overstate our claims. And what we teach our students is not what we practice in that environment. And that destroys our credibility, I think, because at some later moment you will be exposed, actually, it wasn't true, or you can't do this. And I feel very concerned about whether if the same discipline that we want to teach our students, actually we teach our researchers to have that too, in that space. I'm not sure we do that. I'm not sure we do that enough.
Craig, and then I would like to, after Craig's comment, I would like to open the floor for questions from the audience, because you were very quiet in the dark there. We had this technology to receive the questions. I'm not sure if I'm so technologically handicapped. I think that's the problem. So I really cannot see the questions. So Greg, and then if you have any questions, then please wave.
Sure. I'm not sure if it's a paradox or a contradiction in terms, but I would agree with my colleagues who've been saying that a university is a place for disagreement. University of California at Berkeley, the epicenter of the counterculture in the 1960s, Haight-Ashbury, the famous intersection, and so on. Twice now we've seen public talks being shut down because some students, or rather, it looks like people not from the university, but various factions, I don't like your message, therefore you can't speak here. And then the university responds, and it's a matter of debate whether it's legitimate or not, with security concerns. So Ann Coulter, the right-wing ideologue, who I actually don't think is an ideologue, I think she's a court jester myself. But at any rate, Republican students on campus wanted her to speak, and another group threatened action, disruption, and the university has essentially capitulated, and that talk, as far as I know, is not going to take place. The idea that the university should be opening its doors wider than ever is one I absolutely applaud. And Renee, using the metaphor of the university getting into bed with people in power, my only caution is I would hope that condoms are nearby. New Zealand gets it right in this regard. I think there's an official science advisor to the Prime Minister, and that advisor has, as it were, a team of people employed at universities and so on, so that that information is presented in a comprehensible and comprehensive way to the administrations of power, so that decisions can be made that are informed rather than simply ideologically motivated, and that the people under the aegis of the science advisor also have the right to make their positions known. They're not muzzled, in other words. Funding of the university, you all know far more about that than I ever will. I will say this, going to the United States and working in public radio there, I lived in North Carolina for 3 years and worked at an NPR, National Public Radio Affiliate, and there they do what they are nicknamed pejoratively begathons. They go on the air asking listeners for money. They do not have a state model of funding. It is all from listeners. It's all, as it were, market-based. And I used to sneer at that until I went there because it actually buttresses that relationship with the public. There are ways of creating firewalls. Blue Shield, Blue Cross, North Carolina is a health insurance company, so-called. And it's a very powerful institution, and as you probably know, health insurance in the United States works against the interests of its clients, by and large. They will try to screw you. And the radio station did a story critical of this health insurance agency, which threatened then to pull out its funding of the station. And the station's response was simple: see you later. There are ways to draw a firewall, but I'll leave that to finer minds than mine. Opening the doors to the university to younger people, and also reaching out for those who are already in the academy. In the United States, it is not as rosy a picture as it is in Europe when it comes to people going to university. It may well be true that enrollments are strong or high. In the United States, between 2010 and 2014, that's just 4 years, college enrollment dropped by over 800,000. That's nearly 1 million people. University college is more expensive than ever. Employment opportunities are look at, this is post-2008, post-collapse, and that's when the joke, maybe you've heard it, was born. What do you say to somebody who has a BA, a bachelor in English literature? I'll have a Big Mac and fries. What do you say to somebody who has a doctorate in literature? Make that a Big Mac and fries, doctor. If you don't have a university or college degree, the chances of getting a job that's well-paying are significantly reduced. So it just keeps cycling back and back and back on itself, keeping the doors open as far as you can, and pushing to keep public space public so that we're not all becoming markets. Ever since the Reagan era, when no such thing as society, Margaret Thatcher, market, market, market. Well, we're not a market, you know, we're not a market. We're a culture. And I think there are many places now that are buttressing the relationship to the community in predictable ways, having public talks and so on, and unpredictable ways of getting into high schools, of funding. For example, the University of Waterloo has a sub-institute called the Perimeter Institute, a theoretical physics institute, and they've got a whole thing with girls and physics. So the problem of girls not excelling at mathematics in high school, they're pushing back against this and picking out promising people, and the determinant is not high marks in mathematics. They have to have a certain level of competence, but they'll get involved in programs that they're offering because of their enthusiasm or passion or potential as well. So there's endless possibility to reach out once you're inside the academy and to keep reaching people to come in it. And I hope that this trend of keeping people coming in and keeping these numbers strong continues.
Hello, I'm Richard Harvey from the University of East Anglia. I'm very interested in these societal schisms that are happening. Broadly speaking, graduates voted one way in Brexit and they voted one way in Trump. And I think it's very, very important that we are able to communicate to non-graduates, the other side of the debate. And I was listening to the BBC radio programme More or Less recently, in which it was pointed out that we as academics are very trained in dealing with people telling us that you are wrong and presenting a whole load of evidence for that. It's a big shock when it happens, but we don't like it, but we're used to it. And I have a feeling that we are engaging in the debate by telling people that they are wrong and expecting them to believe the facts, despite the psychology of argument, which shows that is a very, very bad way to influence people. But I'd be very interested in the panel's opinion on what's the right way then? What's the right way for us to communicate with people who have not been to university and are not likely to go to university?
In a sense, if you rephrase it, how do you reach Mike Bridger, who was there on the screen before?
Yeah, exactly right.
Not giving him the book of Gender Trouble by Judith Butler, but how do we do it?
Well, it's a mistake. One of the things I was taught when I was starting out in broadcasting is never overestimate the knowledge base of your listener, but never underestimate their intelligence. Let's not forget that most people in the United States did not vote for Donald Trump. You know, even on the popular vote, it's what, 3 million? But one of the lesser played out stories, at least in the North American journalism world, was, and all the ink spilled over the Trump election and Trump and so on, 43% didn't vote. 43% of the electorate did not vote. There's a lot to answer for in that. So it's not just a question of experts failing somehow to reach people. There's a whole political disengagement as well, and and political culture, that plays into it. People in the United States are not, despite the caricatures sometimes of themselves or elsewhere, stupid. Gun laws after the Newton massacre, 35 people killed, most of them children. Most Americans overwhelmingly support some kind of gun control measure. It's the mobilization. One of the criticisms I have of my friends who are in the academy, mostly in the humanities, is that ever since the Reagan era, the left increasingly, the political left, has retreated, I would say, more and more into academia. And the right, damn them, got activated, mobilized in society, and still are. They cheated sometimes, but they have really mobilized. And so, there's a complex of things can go into it, but if you're an academic wondering what I can do, one thing I urge academics that I come across is don't wait to be asked to the dance when it comes to engaging in some kind of public discourse. Think of yourselves as the media yourself. There are many ways to come up with an op-ed article or to do it on your own terms, so you're not sitting around on some 8-minute televised debate and you have maybe 30 seconds and so on. These places, particularly public service journalistic outlets, are resource strapped. And if you come at them with an idea, engage. Don't wait to be asked to the dance. Get up and dance.
Ute, dance.
Well, I think your question is very interesting. What do we lack, or what do we have to improve to communicate? And I think that we have at least 3 shortcomings in the selection process of professors. What we do is we look very much on publications, research money, and I'm far from denying that this kind of expertise is very, very crucial. But we do not look very much at teaching abilities. We do not look very much at communicating abilities. I think Judith Butler can write like this in her books, but she should, and we all should be able to communicate in different contexts, in different languages. So it's not about the books, the scientific books, but it's about how to communicate in the public. And this has to be something. And the third thing is leadership. We are not well prepared for leadership in universities as a professor. And you can say that we should change the selection criteria, or we should invest more in personal development once persons are in this situation to be a professor at university. And we should think about that.
I would like to respond to that question from the scientific point of view again. I think this is one of the questions that we addressed as one of the major challenges for, we have knowledge, but still people don't do what they should do based on the knowledge. So at the University of Gothenburg, we have a center within the Challenges project that is called Collective Action. And that is just to do research on why do people not react to knowledge. And I think that is one way of contributing. That's what we can do as scientists in universities. We can contribute with knowledge on these difficult questions. So you can look at that on the website. It's a really interesting project, actually.
Richard, I don't know the answer, apart from perhaps we should listen first to what the concerns are from people who need information, and then translate it into a form that they would listen to. And I agree, we've also got researchers working on how do you get the public to actually take note of health research, health services research and the like, and change their lifestyles. But I think where we are behind the curve, but there is public money available at the moment, is using social science research to understand the phenomenon of the post-truth world. We've been quite successful through Horizon 2020 and through UK-based research councils in questioning issues around independence, around the Arab Spring and how it came about, and then disseminating the outcomes from that research across a range of audiences. But you cannot underestimate the difficulty of actually getting the information that you need in order to give meaningful understanding to why the current situation has come around. And I think one of the things we as universities have to do is be courageous in supporting that kind of research, where the risk assessments may not seem very favourable, but be courageous in doing that and getting those layers of understanding of what's happening back into the public domain, not in order to say to people you're wrong, but just to try to understand where they're all coming from.
One more comment.
So we were talking today in the workshop on societal impact, and I think one of the interesting discussions we had there was about how we measure the societal impact that we have as researchers, and that is about how we change behaviour. And I think if we don't assess ourselves on how successful we've been at changing perceptions and behaviours, then we'll carry on doing what we've always done. So we've got to think about different ways that we can assess ourselves that will encourage us to engage more in a two-way dialogue rather than a one-way communication that can happen. Sort of, I think you've used the phrase, the sage on the stage. We have to change that model and be more listening, dialogue, as other people have said. So I think it's, what gets measured gets done. So we have to think about how we're going to hold ourselves accountable as well. and what sorts of changes we want to see in society through our work, and how we encourage that sort of behaviour in our community of scientists and social scientists.
Sure.
Yeah, your question is, I think, spot on, and it's not one that's going to go away anytime soon. In the interview that we did with the science advisor in New Zealand, we actually asked him that question, what do you do when you come face to face with a climate denier? And he says, he backs off his conclusion. He doesn't start with his conclusion. He backs off of that at first and just starts to explain the step-by-step as clearly as he can why he reached that. And he's prepared for blowback, meaning that it might take more than one go for it to sink in. But he didn't presume a superior position. He just said, well, the reason I think that is when you look here and you look there and you look there, the picture starts to look like this, trying to bring his listener, in this particular case, a fairly hostile person in some audience, along with him. And knowing full well that it might not, that the conversation does not necessarily end there, that what you're engaging is in a longer conversation. So if you don't get it that time, you keep highlighting the process, clarity of reason, and over time, the kind of effect that he was hoping for tends to get realized.
Thank you. Kees Kouwenaar, Vrije Universiteit, Aurora. My question, I think, follows up on Richard's. I would like to ask, and some of you have already started doing that in response to your specific question, but more generally, each of the university representatives to give me maybe 2 examples of things you say, this is something that my university, in view of the post-truth issue, this is something that my university should do better and different from what we do today.
It's a very concrete and difficult thing to answer, but the challenge is yours. 1 or 2 things that your universities should do to respond to the...
Only 2. Sorry? Not firing you. Okay, no. Well, it's hard to imagine that specifically. Coming back on the point I made earlier, I think we're not critical enough to our own researchers in the way that they deal with society. And that some bit of education, not because we as presidents know this, but teaching ourselves to how to fulfill that role in society much more effectively and more convincingly. And I personally feel that requires from us some humility in dealing with difficult questions, that you have part of the answer because of your academic, your scientific knowledge, but that may not be sufficient to keep somebody else happy or satisfied with the answer. How do you deal with that situation? We push our professors for the TV camera and then expect them to do well, and they overstate their claims. That's something we need to do very differently, I think. But let's stop at one case, and then your personal position I consider later on.
I want to strengthen the point Ute Klammer has made. Third mission, it's something I mention in every speech in the last month to highlight to bring awareness to our colleagues. That's a problem. Like the communication must be a dialogue, and if you're sending, you need to receive also, and this communication with society means being reorganized, and every university I think needs some kind of structure. Of course, I have the scientist who does not want to leave the spectrometer or his math formulas and doesn't want to communicate with the society. He is a researcher, right? But as an organization, I think we need a structured way for this communication, and I think this has to be improved.
Well, that's what I thought you would learn us to do. No, seriously, I think it's really important that we look over our systems for steering, rewards, etc., with the perspective of our role in society. And that's actually what we're starting to do in this network.
I was thinking about this from an engineering background, the voice of the customer. So when you're designing a new product, you think about the voice of the customer. And for us, we have multiple customers, our students, our staff are our customers as well in the university, the different stakeholders, big businesses, small businesses, policymakers locally, centrally. So I think it's important for us to try and work out how we hear their voice and how we then use that voice to design the research that we do, how we co-produce the knowledge that we produce, and then how we communicate that knowledge in that dialogic way back when we've found some new knowledge.
I think that in my country, as rectors are elected, I think that universities have tools to play a more important role in public debate. I think that's the first thing we have to do. And then I also think, of course, research. We are building up universities starting from research, but I think that we nowadays also need to focus a little bit more on education and on the question, are we sure about our education? I think we need to adapt our education a little bit more towards the problem of society nowadays. I think that education at university too need to be reformed from that perspective.
I don't think that there is one answer. I think that the network like this is actually where we can exchange experience. I don't think that there is one solution to how we can make this better, but if the goal is, which I think we are discussing, that we combine education and research and cooperation, we can learn from each other. And I would like to say there is one example which I think we will follow it up. That is, we have given money for students who started a social invention organization where they invite business sector, official sector, and students from all different departments and get interaction. And I think that they will learn a lot, and we can learn a lot from what's coming out from that.
Well, as we do move down the line here, it's difficult to come up with new and good ideas, believe me. So, but two things I at least are able to come up with here down the line, and that is, I do think that, well, we've been quite well off or good at educating our teachers and students and whatever there is in academic writing. We need to also provide our staff and students with the ability to engage in discussions with politicians, performing on a stage or in front of a microphone or whatever it is. We are not all that good at that yet. But I think that's important for them to engage in civic discussions or political discussions, whatever there is. That's one thing. The other thing is that I think we actually need to educate ourselves as academics, as professors, in how actually research science knowledge can and should inform policy making. Because I don't think we are good at understanding that dimension. It's pretty easy for climate researchers to think that, okay, now we've shown that with this CO2 emission, we can't reach our 2-degree goal. Okay, then something has to happen. And of course we get people that get disappointed when nothing happens, but we have to understand the political dimensions and all the other dimensions and factors that plays in. Because only then we can also, let's say, provide our knowledge and insight on a proper level in the various process. So my second proposal is to educate ourselves in the process of science-informed policymaking.
Thank you. Well, I think we should first perhaps train our teachers. I don't know for you, but in France, when we recruit a researcher and a teacher, he's supposed to have a pedagogical science infused. And of course, it's not true. Maybe also the teachers who have been already recruited 10 or 20 years ago should also be trained. I mean, I'm sure pedagogy must change. It's an idea in France which is rather new. 10 years ago, you would have said one researcher and one academic should be also a good pedagogue, a good teacher. Just people would have looked at you like that. He had to be a good researcher, and he had to teach, and that's all. I think it's more and more necessary for many reasons. Some of them I've already said. It's that nowadays, I think students are waiting other ways of teaching, are waiting other things from their teachers, and so they should be some more educated to this thing. And which is for me perhaps as important or more important is that in a relationship of learning and teaching, be it from a teacher to students or from a researcher or an academic to people, to citizens to whom he speaks or she speaks, it is very important that the other person is active too. I mean, it's not you and you teach and they learn. It's you are working together to elaborate a knowledge or something like an access to knowledge. And I think it is very important, and I'll give you just a little example. In Grenoble, we have a museum, a very good museum of modern art and contemporary art. Students don't go very much to this museum. What we do is, with the museum, one time a year, the museum is open all night, so it's called Nocturne du Museum, night of the museum, and students prepare this night during some weeks or months before, and that is they choose a work of art, and they are asked to transform it in another thing, dance, commentary, anything, music. And so many of the students, more and more, they do that. And many students come to see that and to participate in that. There is a huge queue this night of the museum on all the streets. And I think it's a good example of what may be done if you put the other persons, the students or the citizen, one who could, on acting too, not only on just being there and trying to hope that he will believe you if you deliver a truth or any message at all.
Thank you. This is a very complex issue, but I would say, as university leaders, we need to promote science and talk to the leaders, the political leaders, and science and education is the key. At the university level, we also have to be very specific, promoting academic freedom, diversity, critical thinking for our staff and students. I mean, those are the key things. And listening to this discussion here, taking part in it, I thought, well, we talked about money being power, communication being power, knowledge is power, for sure. And then I remember what Frank Zappa said, and this is just an opinion. He said, information is not knowledge. Knowledge is not truth. Truth is not wisdom. Wisdom is not beauty. Beauty is not music. Music is the best, so listen to the music.
So I'm not exactly clear in what sort of line I'm next, but I do have some thoughts.
Pretend you're a president of a university.
So I think it's important for universities to do something like community service that may get them into contact with non-academics. I know some of our students at the Free University, they are extraordinarily good in this sort of service. I just relate to one of our team the story that a mathematics student, a black guy, in one of the outskirts of Amsterdam, he figured out that none of the high school kids would go to or make it to the university because they would all fail on mathematics. Now, he was a fine mathematician himself, so he collected a whole group, some 25 guys. So he said it doesn't work with a co-ed group, and all of them went on to university. So he taught them mathematics for 3 years in a row, just extracurricular. He got no reward for it whatsoever. Well, in the end, he got the Echo Reward. That's sort of an interesting prize that's being awarded in the Netherlands to someone who makes this intercultural outreach thing. And you know, we have a lot of creative students with all sorts of sensibilities. They can, you know, I also know of a female student who is very good at playing chess. And as a sort of ambassador of the university, she goes out playing chess in a cafe. Well, I mean, these are the small things, but you know, they and I do endorse the thing that my own president Jaap Winter said. It is we should help ourselves and our colleagues and PhD students to communicate adequately with the press and in public about their research, because we now face this, certainly in the social sciences and in the biometric sciences, we face this reduplication or duplication crisis, or replication crisis. You know, in medical sciences, over 80% of the findings cannot be replicated. Well, there's a whole story to be told about this, but we should educate ourselves about that. And I do think if the university is going to uphold its important role and mission, and it needs to have the appropriate social status, then we should get into this and take it up. So one final number I wrote down, that a colleague of mine, he did a research on, well, not the big things in scientific fraud and confabulation of data, but what he calls the more smallish instances of academic misbehavior or questionable research practices. And he listed some 60 questionable research practices. And he did a research on biomedical scientists, and he asked, it was an anonymous survey, have you committed any questionable research practice over the last 3 years? 34% of them said, yes, we did. Going into deep interviews why they committed those questionable research practices, it all had to do with tenure, with publication pressure. So I do think there's also a reason for us universities to bring into place a certain environment where, I mean, it's not only the personal ethics of academics, which is also important, but it's also the sort of structure that may elicit certain kinds of behaviors like questionable research practices that we don't want to see. So there is work for us to do.
Thank you. And I think one thing we could do is redefine ourselves as places of learning, and that learning is continuously happening. So we're learning about ourselves as institutions, the challenge that post-truth faces us, but also what we could do about it. And that does take in the point you made about the insecurities that all of the people who make up universities and society at large have. We need to be willing to hear those and attempt to address those and not live in a culture of blame and negativity. And another thing I think we probably should do, having been involved in this today amongst ourselves, is bear in mind that we have partners out there, public bodies in particular, but other agencies and collectives of people who are worried about the same thing. And we need to try to have these conversations with them, not just in our own environment.
Thank you. On top of the previous 12 points, all of which I do agree with, I think another thing to think about is a university's sphere of influence, by which I mean think about our place in the region. And my university's 20,000 staff and students, which is over 10% of the regional population, the population of the city of Norwich. And actually, the people of Norwich, therefore, are really actually very interested in the university, and indeed actually very proud of us. And the local radio stations, the local press, provide all sorts of opportunities for staff and students to learn how to engage and to learn how to communicate. And they want to pick up stories, they want to celebrate the successes of the university. And so, we do train our research students and our staff in communication media, and there's all sorts of people in the region are willing to pick that up and give them a chance. And as a leader of a university that has a strong position in the region, people want the leader to be involved in regional development and working with the leaders in the region, the local authority leaders, the leaders of businesses, and through that again you can get influence. So whilst we spend a lot of time thinking about our international reputation and the National League tables, we have a huge sphere of influence just around us, and that can be very powerful as well. So make use of it, I would say.
Okay, our rector, Ulrich Radke, has already spoken on behalf of our university. I'm no longer a member of the rectorate, so it's not my turn to give advice to my own university. I did this for 7 years. So I can only speak for myself, and I have to say, I have two big goals as a professor. One is in research, to do research in a way that it is it's a help for developing societies further. I spent much time in commissions and advisory boards to politics and civil society, and I hope more colleagues will engage in such kind of activities. And what regards my students, I think it's very important to help them, to assist them to develop their own personalities, to become smart, but also reflective and knowledgeable persons for future society, and this is our task.
In English, you often hear, the truth, pure and simple, is such and such and such and such. Well, Oscar Wilde, over 100 years ago, had his own wonderful repose to that, and he said, the truth is rarely pure and never simple. And in a post-truth so-called context, I think those words are more operative than ever. Wilde himself was the product of a brilliant set of university careers in Ireland and in England. And when I think of the root or the sound of that word university, universe, I think the expansive nature of it, it's a pretty resilient institution. Look at its history, and we need it more than ever, I would argue. I would suggest as well that the hunger among quote-unquote real people, non-academics, is stronger than ever. The goalposts of authority shifted a long time ago, I think, among people who are hungry to think and who enjoy thinking. And it's not just limited to people who go to or who work at a university. Meaning, less tell me and more show me. We're living in a golden age of documentary making. We're living in a golden age of nonfiction production. And the university can capitalize on that wave. I had a life-altering moment when, for 5 years, I worked at Radio Netherlands Worldwide and lived in Amsterdam, and we went off to do a training session in Nigeria, in a provincial town called Ilorin, which on a map is 5 hours north of Lagos, but in real life on Nigerian roads is more like about a day. And we did a 3-day workshop with a partner radio station there, about 20 people, ranging in age from 19 to 40, some of whom did not have English as their first language, but had a local language as their first language. And they knew that their state-sanctioned media was, for the most part, crap. They were media lit, so they listened to BBC World, they would watch CNN World, they would even download This American Life, the American public radio program, and so on. I would urge my colleagues to consider any kind of form of public outreach, even the simplest one of public talks. I was in Vancouver recently, and a mathematician, French, Cédric Villani, spoke about the beauty of mathematics at an old Art Deco theater, and 1,100 people showed up for this. The audiences are there. The hunger is there. And I hope that the institutions reward and support this kind of outreach. It does not displace publication. There's no need to become a self-hating intellectual. We have enough of self-hating government right now. And I'll end with another anecdote, and I'm fully aware that a collection of anecdotes, the plural of anecdote is not data, but we have a problem in Canada. It's not all just Justin Trudeau and his endless stream of photo ops. We have a real problem and a shameful history with Aboriginal or First Nations people, as they're now called. That's the preferred term, First Nations, Indigenous. And it's tough. Whenever the CBC, which is still a vaunted institution, according to the polls in Canada, does a story featuring some kind of Aboriginal or First Nations or Indigenous issue, the level of public engagement on the websites and so on is filled with the most bile-filled, hate-filled, misogynist, racist tripe that you can imagine. And now we're in a bind. What do we do? What do we do? We keep urging audiences to engage. We measure our own metrics for engagement, and then you get this bullshit. What do you do? Well, one of the things that various news agencies are doing, and I applaud it, we're starting to do it now, is you ask your audience to answer 2 or 3 very simple questions which demonstrate that they have listened to or read the thing at hand. And then that shuts down the hate and the endless social media bubbling and an endless sort of evil parthenogenesis where like speaks only to like. And lo and behold then, when you're going to interview the Cree mother whose children are suffering because the water they're drinking has lead in it or other contaminants, she doesn't want to put herself up for this kind of hatred and this kind of, public, well, it's only a fraction of the public, doesn't want to subject herself to that, and I don't blame her. But when that door is shut so that criticism can be tolerated, but just pure race hatred cannot be, that is something that CBC and others can do a lot more of to shut down the hate. It's actually disproportionately overrepresented. Most people are not like that. Most people are actually, like I say, curious, might be skeptical, but actually do want to know. And it's to keep the long conversation going. We interviewed a German sociologist recently, Aladin Mathalani, and one of the points that came out of this conversation was, again buttressed by yet another anecdote, is in the United States where the KKK, the Ku Klux Klan, has become more politically engaged than it ever has been. The son of the KKK's leader was sent off to university because he was digitally literate, and his goal, his mission, was to convert university students to the cause. But he had to hide his operations from his contemporaries, and he was outed. He was outed one day, and he was vilified and ostracized and almost beaten up, I think, at one point. So he didn't show up at university for a while. Well, a bunch of these younger students had been keeping a kind of Sunday, what would you say, a little salon, a little get-together at breakfast time on a Sunday to, work off the hangover. And the guy who was the head of this little group kept inviting the son of the KKK leader to come, and others said, I won't come. But the guy did. The son of the KKK leader did come, and they wouldn't talk about politics at first. They would just talk about sports and so on. But kept it going. Eventually a few more people would come, and then a few more, and they would edge into politics. You can probably predict how this narrative went. Breaking point was reached. This son, who was the digital point of the spear, so to speak, for the ideological incursion into the university to spread this extreme right, this KKK ideology, felt his worldview getting frayed with the succession of conversations he was having with Black, Hispanic, Asian Muslim students and so on, gay students and so on. And then he had to hide yet again, but this time the change of opinion from his own father, and then it got really Oedipal. He came out, outed himself, went online to all of the people he had been serving before, these extreme right-wingers, and said what I believed was wrong. Keeping the long conversation going is one of the things that you all are highly equipped to do, and I hope to God you continue doing it.
Thank you. Time is really up, and we still have one topic on the agenda which we really have no time to discuss here. But anyway, I would like to ask Jaap Winter to respond to it anyhow. And the question was, what can Aurora do here? What can Aurora do that the individual universities cannot do? And that will be the closing statement, very short one. Your vision of Aurora dealing with issues we've been talking about here. How can Aurora make the university stronger than they do individually?
Well, I think one of the core things that I've sensed myself with the Aurora network and where I get energy from is that the challenge that we face individually as a universities are not just your own challenges. We have friends out there, we have friends here, we have friends here. That helps a lot, actually. For each of us, this is not easy. There's not one answer. There's a set of discussions and dialogues, and you have to continue, you have to have the patience to persist. Doing that together is much easier than doing it on your own. And that's the strong sense that I've had since the first discussions I've had with any of us on this network. Doing it together is both much more fun and probably yielding much better results. So having these discussions, for us as presidents, thinking, well, maybe it's not enough to have a discussion like this, so what do we do next time? How do we build on this? Are there some best practices that we've talked about that we can actually put to work? How do we do that collectively rather than having to figure that out on your own? That's the strength of this network for me, I would believe, and I hope that we'll use all our future engagements to make that happen.
I thank you all. I think post-truth, that's what universities are always dealing with. We are looking for the truth. It can be just an ideal. We may not believe in truth. We may not believe that there is a thing there that is truth, but at least we need to have the ideal that we are seeking something through our endeavor, which is closer to knowledge and whatever ideal we can call truth. And also what I feel from us now here is that what we really need to do, and do better than we have been doing so far, is social engagement. And that is very much the kind of ideal of Aurora, to increase that kind of workings in our. And that is something that I think we can learn from each other. And so this conference has helped us in that respect. So thank you all for the discussion, and I thank you for being so patient and silent there.